I now want to talk a little bit about the history of industrial organizational psychology. And you're going to find as you get more and more involved in the field of IO psychology, potentially more involved with PSYOP and the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, and even talking to additional industrial organizational psychologists, both practitioners and scientists, that there is a fair amount of pride, if you will, in our field, in what we do and what we bring to organizations, and also a bit of a sense of a history. For the most part, most industrial organizational psychologist degrees can easily trace their chain of PhDs or their education back to pretty much the founder of psychology in Germany, Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt. So, for example, you can actually go into various organizations that have listings of where people got their PhDs and create a chain like I have, looking back at where I got my PhD from, where the person that gave me my PhD got theirs from, and all the way back again to Wundt. So this just kind of again shows this history that IO psychology, the application of the psychological science to real world problems, has a deep and rich history that goes all the way back to some degree to the start of psychology itself. So we're going to talk about some major events that kind of shaped IO psychology into what it is today, where the initial concepts of applying psychological science to real world problems, both organizational, private, and public, and kind of how that has continued to shape how IO psychology is practiced and researched to this day. So again, it starts in 1876 with Wilhelm Wundt. We basically have an initial concept of psychology basically started in Germany and the United States. In Germany with Wundt and in the United States with James. And there was a little bit of a difference in kind of how they were viewing psychology. And Wundt had a very systematic way of trying to reduce human behavior to measurable science. And this also pretty much has a strong kind of I-side feel to it. If you actually look at the psychology coming out of the United States at approximately the same time, you find a little bit more, honestly, of a bit of a holistic kind of what is the meaning of the behaviors. And to some degree, that's where we see a fair amount of the O side coming from. And the O side really doesn't become a part of industrial organizational psychology until much later on. So initial industrial organizational psychology wasn't industrial, it was industrial organizational, it was just either psychology, applied psychology, or industrial psychology. um, we have some of the first books on applying psychological principles to organizational problems with Hugo Munsterberg and James Cattell. During World War I, we have the Stanford Binet test in Europe and the Army Alpha and Beta test in the United States. And let me talk about that a little bit. So honestly, when we look at the history of IO psychology, it follows along with world history fairly closely. And think about the first two world wars, World War I and World War II. Two of the primary players in both of those wars were Germany and the United States, where psychology had its basically foundings. And in both of these situations, we have countries, organizations, the United States and Germany, that are finding themselves in a new situation where in the past, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but technology was not a major part of war prior to World War I. You had cavalry, you had infantry, you definitely had artillery, you had some technological skills, you had combat engineering. But for the most part, the vast majority of war was fought by fairly easily trained skills with fairly simple tools. World War I, not only do we see a mass mobilization of militaries, we see more of the populations than have happened in the past being brought into kind of a total war mindset, World War I. You also have technology suddenly. It's not just how to use a rifle, it's how do you actually maintain a tank? How do you drive a tank? How do you shoot artillery from moving platforms? How do you fly a plane? How do you use radios? How do you use chemical warfare? So suddenly you had a vast need, both in the United States and in Germany, to be able to quickly identify people that would be suited, have the ability to learn more advanced skills. How do you identify out of these 30 people that are currently slated to be infantrymen, which one would make a good tank engineer? Which one would make a good pilot? And a lot of these organizations, this wasn't happening on a one-to-one scale. We're talking about mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people at a time. Both countries started to use testing. They started to basically turn to psychology to determine how do we measure the knowledge, skills, and abilities of recruits to better identify how we should train them. And considering that we're now training them in advanced skills, how do we better train them? And how do we know the training worked before we trust them with a very expensive piece of equipment, a tank or an airplane? So World War I is really our first big driver of kind of formalizing industrial psychology, the application of psychology to the measurement of human differences to help decision making. We see the first doctoral program arrive in Ohio State about this time during World War I, and we also see the first PhD specifically listed as an industrial psychologist awarded to Lillian Gilbreth in 1917. And most of her research actually by today's eyes would be more human factors. She was doing time and motion studies. By the end of World War I, there's around 10 to 18 actual IO psychologists in the world with a PhD specifically in this field and actually helping to grow the field. Now, the problem though is that at the end of World War I, we no longer have that big drive needing to basically assess and assign large groups of people by a major organization. And at the same time, the business world is currently going through basically the Industrial Revolution. They're moving from a model of people that are basically learning crafts, one craft at a time in apprenticeships, and moving to industrial creations of basically factories or assembly lines. One of the ways to think about this is that before the 1850s, if you were going to be a barrel maker, you would apprentice for 5 to 10 years with a barrel maker. You would learn how to find the right woods, you'd learn how to cut and cure the woods, you'd learn how to bend the wood to where it was in the right shape, you would learn metalworking, you'd learn how to pick the right metals, you would learn how to make the metal bands, you would learn the process of putting the barrel together in such a way that it actually would be water or airtight, how you create the seals, what chemicals you use. You would learn all of that, and at the end you would be a master of barrel making. You could start with raw materials and make a barrel from the ground up. Well, the problem with this is it's great for craftsmanship, it's great for ownership of what you're building, but it's actually not a very efficient way when you need to make hundreds of thousands of barrels. What a more efficient way is an assembly line. So instead of spending 5 years learning all of that, you spend 2 weeks learning how to cut wood, and that's all you ever do. That's your part of the process. And when the wood is cut, you turn it over to the person that cures the wood, and that's all they ever learn to do. And once the wood is cured, you turn it over to the person that actually forms the wood into the bow that it needs to be in. And again, down the line, someone is making the straps, and that's all they ever know, and that's what they know how to do. You can now train 10 or 11 people with a very simple skill to then create hundreds of barrels very quickly and with much less time overall in training for a similar product at a much lower cost. So since that's what was happening in the business world, at the end of World War I, there really wasn't a lot of latitude for a psychologist to say, hey, I can tweak your selection methods. Because they were already moving from a model where you would have one person take 5 years of training to produce maybe in one day 1 barrel, to a system where you had 10 people, lowly paid, trained in 2 weeks, producing hundreds of barrels per day. So that kind of increase in productivity and clear profit was not an environment that was conducive to wanting the small improvements that you can get through using industrial organizational or industrial psychology in this case to help decision making. So like I said, at the time that IO psychology kind of came out of World War I with some steam behind it, it found that most organizations weren't necessarily that interested in fine-tuned selection of advanced skills because that's not what they were doing. They were hiring people for very simplified tasks. They were doing classic organizational theory, and the idea behind classical organizational theory is basically the bureaucracy. You have a very hierarchical system. You have a president or CEO. Under him are VPs. Under him are junior VPs. Under them are senior managers. Under them are managers. And then the managers are the ones that make sure everyone's doing the work. So that's classical organizational theory. And for companies that were switching to assembly lines, this actually is a pretty good system. It's a best practice. It's a practitioner view. And most organizations were adopting it because it worked in most situations, especially for any organization that was moving to mass production. So again, when industrial organizational psychologists would come up and say, yes, but it doesn't work well for every situation, most business people looked at him and went, yes, it does. Now, that wasn't the truth, but it was so powerfully a new way to look at business that there wasn't a lot of latitude for IO psychology to get basically their claws, if you will, into the private sector after World War I. Likewise, we have scientific management from Frederick Taylor, and many people came up with various models for this. And again, the idea is you improve productivity not through how you select people, not how you treat them, but by simply simplifying the task to the level where you don't need to worry about selection. That basically you simplify the task to the point where anyone can do it. Then you train workers on that simple task, and then you put them in an assembly line of other people that do other tasks, and then you simply put it in order. So where before it might take, honestly, a genius with an enormous amount of mechanical and engineering skill to build a single car, you now have 100 employees, none of which have any real knowledge, skills, and ability in engineering at all, who each know how to build one single part and add it to the process. This is also where we find the Theory X and Theory Y model of business. Basically, Theory X is what was kind of broadly given to classical organizational and classic scientific management. And the reason it was called Theory X kind of post hoc is that it is the theory that the way you do business is to treat people as robots. You are trying to create an environment where they have no choice but to perform and they can't really mess up. And this does have great advantage when you're trying to move from building 1 barrel a day to building 100 barrels a day, but it does come at a cost, and these costs would catch up with businesses and organizations as we move forward, and also as technology became more and more advanced to where you couldn't simplify the tasks down to a level. There are certain things that can't be simplified. If you actually are designing a new car, you can't train an engineer how to just design one arc on a plan. You need someone that can think about the holistic issue and have that skill set. So as we also start to move out of from World War I to World War II, we start to see the cracks form in this classical organizational theory, this scientific management, which starts to be called kind of broadly Theory X. Because what's being found is that they start trying to apply these same principles to more advanced or complex jobs, and it's not working. And that starts to also bring us Theory Y. And Theory Y is kind of the idea, revolutionary as it was at the time, that you might need to treat people like people. So let's just broadly look at that Theory X and Theory Y, because this is all developing throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. Today we look at it very clearly as Theory X and Theory Y, but these two theories were kind of fighting each other during this time. And there's a lot of back and forth. And honestly, Theory Y is where we start to also get the formation of organizational psychology. So again, a Theory X approach, its orientation towards people is distrusting. The idea behind Theory X is that people will not work, will not do their best, and are going to be lazy unless you oversight, watch them, and create a situation where they have to work. The assumptions about people is that they're basically lazy, that you either have to have basically a manager watching over them or a system that does not allow them to fail in order for them to perform well, that the average person is disinterested in work. They don't care about it. They don't want to be invested in it. They just want to get it done, get their paycheck, and go on with their lives. And the condition in which people will work hard is only when pushed. So that's Theory X. Now, notice we refer to this as the traditional approach, and we often talk about Theory X as a negative, as something that we don't want to do. But do recognize there are some jobs that fit better with Theory X. If you truly are in a model where it is a very low-skilled job, it doesn't require a lot of training, it doesn't require a lot of skill, and the people that take the job just intrinsically are not going to like it, you probably need a Theory X approach to make sure that you actually stay productive. Now, in IO psychology, we'll often try to move companies away from Theory X situations, but just recognize that not always is that the right solution. There are some jobs that just are not fun to do, and no one's going to be engaged doing them. And that in those situations, you probably do need to be a little distrusting. You probably do need to create a situation where the situation makes sure the person works well. And efforts to make people actually interested in the job are probably not going to succeed. Now, where possible, we do want to move to theory Y. The orientation towards people is accepting and basically about promoting them and making them better. How do we actually make sure the job actually enriches the person? That we assume people want to achieve, they want to be responsible, they want to work hard, that they're going to be interested in work, and that they work when appropriately trained and recognized, not necessarily oversight and pushed. Now notice that theory Y fits very well in kind of white collar jobs, more complex jobs, jobs that require more skill. So if you've got someone that spent 8 years becoming a doctor, and you try to use theory X with them, you don't trust them, you think they're lazy, you try to force them to work, and you constantly are looking over their shoulder to make sure they're doctoring, you're probably going to find someone that leaves your organization. They're not going to enjoy it, and they're basically going to be, I don't need to be watched over. I became a doctor to help people. A theory Y approach is going to work better there. But if you have someone who literally the job is they double check a particular seal on a tire at a tire factory, and to make sure those tires do not fail on cars, the job is necessary, and you have to check 1,000 tires per hour. A theory Y approach, trying to get them to engage in the job, trying to make sure that they're satisfied and that they're interested, trying to get them to have ownership, may actually just take away from the job they need to do. So again, just recognize that theory X and theory Y are not mutually exclusive. One is not always the solution. But if you can move an organization towards a more theory Y approach, there are benefits. Both morally, you're making a job that's actually pleasant to have, but also if you can make a job where it is interesting, where there is self-motivation, generally people are going to do a better job at it too. It's a lot easier to have people self-motivate than it is to have to force them to be motivated. So as we leave this gap between World War II and World War I and II, again, in that gap, we do see a refinement of techniques. We see a scientific push in industrial organizational psychology. There's a lot of research being happened. We also see a fair amount of interest in human factors at this time, and that's where it kind of becomes its own field and kind of breaks off a little bit from IO psychology, because even in this classic theory X world, even when we're looking at scientific management, what we're talking about is assembly lines. We're talking about individuals being trained, hopefully as simply as possible, to operate technology. So how do you make the technology easier to learn? That's human factors. Also during this time, though, we have Kurt Lewin starting to do a lot of research, and he's often cited as a founder of social psychology, but there's also a pretty strong argument that he's one of the founders of organizational psychology as well, because what he was interested in was group behavior, group performance, leadership, and leadership performance. So we see a lot of that research happening between World War I and II. By the time World War II rolls around, we have about 100 IO psychologists specifically branded with that PhD functioning in the world, mainly doing research, mainly in the academic settings. And we get to World War II. Once again, Germany and the United States, kind of the two hotbeds of psychology, go to war with even more advanced technologies, even more things that we're now having to think about, including advanced science, advanced weapons, radar, advanced systems. And again, we have two major companies doing massive mobilization and asking the question, how do we quickly identify who would make a better pilot versus research scientist versus infantryman? And both organizations, the United States and Germany, during this war, turned to their own IO psychologists to help them in this process. So during the World War II and into the 60s, we see the development of assessment centers. We also see coming out of World War II the Hawthorne studies. Those were the studies that basically found that no matter what intervention you did in various organizations, you tended to find improvements, and it actually made the kind of groundbreaking study of the time that it wasn't the interventions themselves, it was actually just paying attention to the people in the job, that they were enjoying being treated like people, being asked questions. Do you like the lighting up? Do you like the lighting down? They actually responded to actually being included in the process of the decision making. And that really starts the whole human relations movement in the O side. This is also where we start to see people not just have PhDs in IO psychology, but a lot of master's degree programs are being developed coming out of World War II. And again, we start to see a lot of masters doing practice more than science in IO psychology. By the mid-1960s, there's over 750 IO psychologists, many of them being master's degrees. And also, we started to see more and more organizations after World War II starting to look for another edge. In other words, the Industrial Revolution of moving towards that classical organizational theory and scientific management had pretty much been adapted everywhere. And now they were starting to see the cracks. They were starting to see the burnout. They were starting to see the fact that Theory X was not necessarily leading them to people that wanted to work, and that there was a lot of management required to make sure people were doing those jobs in those situations. And IO psychologists started to be called upon to how do we adapt these techniques to all situations? How do we use management to actually manage people that are working in complex jobs? And even in the simple assembly line jobs, is there things we can do to make those jobs more appealing? In the mid-60s through the mid-80s, we have a couple of major developments. The field really becomes an identifiable field at this point. So as we recognize IO psychology today, basically was formed through the 60s, mainly late 60s through the 70s and 80s. We see the first handbook of IO psychology in 1976, and that basically defined what it was IO psychology and kind of uses the terms that we use to this day. We see validity generalization procedures basically developed but also supported by court decisions. And basically what that is saying is that we find that scientists are being able to say these procedures are both legal and successful in these organizations. Therefore, we can probably generalize the use of these practitioner, in other organizations. By the end of the mid-1980s, we're looking at about 2,000 IO psychologists, and it's starting to be truly identified as its own job field, and a lot of private organizations are starting to value IO psychologists. But the biggest impact on IO psychology from this period is what I skipped over at the start, and that was the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights legislation and the Civil Rights Movement. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VII really redefined the legality of how organizations hired, the processes they used for hiring, and the processes they used for promotion and performance appraisal. There suddenly was a legal eye watching these procedures. There also was an enforcement arm of these acts, these laws, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who could enforce and actually bring legal charges against an organization that was found to be in violation of the Civil Rights Act and Title VII. This suddenly meant that organizations needed human resource individuals that were trained in scientific methodology and psychometrics. So this one legislation pretty much guaranteed that IO psychology was going to be a major part of the business world, at least within the United States, moving forward. So kind of from the mid-1980s to the present, there really hasn't been any major change in the structure of what drives IO psychology. Organizations now value the smaller impacts that they can get from better selection, better assessment, better training. And all of these, when I say are small improvements, it's small compared to the vast improvements that, again, industrialization and scientific management brought in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But once that was done, that's what's left, these smaller improvements. And also the need to be able to legally defend how they're making selection, promotion, and training decisions. We do see changes. Personality assessments become revitalized. Up until about the mid-1980s, personality really wasn't being measured in IO psychology. It was mainly we measured knowledge, we measured skills, and we measured ability, usually cognitive ability. But again, as we sanctified or made normal the use of these methods, we started to look for, is there anything else we can measure, especially if we're talking about person-job fit, and that's where personality came back in. We definitely had a major cognitive movement in psychology, so basically affecting how people think and view the world and how they frame events to determine and to help them either look at things more positively or to live their lives better. We definitely see a changing demographics in the workforce and the nature of work. We see a vast increase in work teams. We also see a vast change in diversity within organizations and also across cultures as more and more organizations became global. We see the first publication of the Handbook of IO Psychology and the revision of these books in 1990 and 93. And adding on to the Civil Rights Act, we see new laws. American with Disability Act, the CRA of 1991, Family and Medical Leave Act, all of these additionally cemented the need to have IO psychologists watching the procedures that were now legally actionable if they were found to be biased. Currently, there's approximately 3,000 to 4,000 IO psychologists functioning in the world, which is still a fairly small number, but again, has a very large impact. Most major organizations will have some form of IO psychologist or even a team of IO psychologists working within them today, mainly focused on these issues. So just a quick timeline kind of starting. We start with Cattell measuring individual differences and developing the first mental test in the 1880s and 90s. We have Munsterberg arriving at Harvard, the American Psychological Association is found, and Munsterberg in 1913 publishes the first English test in IO psychology. During World War I, we have the Army enlisting Scotts and Brigham to develop intelligence tests. We also have Llewellyn Gilbreth, awarded the first IO psychologist. In the 1930s, we have Mayo doing his studies on the Hawthorne studies and kind of identifying the human component in scientific management. We see the first modern textbook published in IO psychology. So this isn't a book for practitioners. This is a book to teach others how to do IO psychology in 1932. Again, we see human factors and again selection and assessment and training in World War II in 1941. In 1945, IO psychology officially becomes a division of the APA. In 1950, we see the explosion of commercial tests for selection and for performance appraisal in private organizations in the United States and Germany first, but then throughout the world. And again, 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act and the legalization of defending or having to defend how you do selection and performance. And 1982 is actually when PSYOP, our governing body, and governing is probably, again, the wrong word, but it is our professional organization that looks out for the interests of industrial organizational psychologists wherever they practice, whether it's practice or science.